But I want to change gears and discuss an area that is of great importance, especially to the business world, and that is managing risk. Of course, quite relatively a new branch in terms of management, the traditional management of the corporate world. And speaking to joining me now is David Tatam, who is an author in the area of risk management. He has written a book actually on operational risk, and he's also a specialist in the area of risk. He has traveled the world, and so he will be sharing his experiences to us about how companies, be they small, medium or large corporates, can manage their risk. Many thanks, David, for joining us on PM Live.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
All right, David, I've done a small research and study on you, and you've written quite extensively, traveled the world speaking about risk and specifically, operational risk. Why is this area so passionate and so close to your heart?
I think it's an area that is untapped in the sense of the value it can add to an organisation, and I guess we look at it from two angles. One is what I might call the deliberate risk events, such as corruption, fraud, and those things that I guess make an individual think about themselves only rather than the collective. And so a lot of risk management is about getting the organisation to think more collectively for the good of the group, and a lot of that comes down to risk, fraud, corruption and so on. And the second part is what I call accidental risk, which are all the things that we experience every day: tripping over power cords, power failures, IT failures, and in the same token that can detract an awful lot of value from the organisation. If you put the two of those together, there is a huge value add to come out of it. And I think to finish with on that comment is that risk is often seen as a negative thing, but there's a huge opportunity managing it properly. So I'm passionate about it because of the value it can add, and I think it's quite untapped.
Quite interesting. Of course, I'll be coming to talk to you a bit about the aspect of a risk being an opportunity. But when you look at most companies, where I started by saying it tends to be quite a relatively new area in most organizations, other than especially the financial sector. Many companies for long didn't consider even having so much of a risk department. Why are we having all this new energy to look and establish risk departments?
I think there's probably two main drivers from it. Number one is I think that the general public have become a lot more aware of risk as we've become more globalised, and I guess almost going back to 9/11 when the public were thrust in their faces terrorist risk. Since that we've had many corporate disasters, particularly out of the US, so I think the general public's become a lot more aware of it. I think the other side of it is that in certain industries it's been legislated against, in the sense of the banking industry with the Basel framework. The banks had to do something, and it finally kind of managed to put funds towards it to say we need to do something. And I think since that has come in, people have now started to realise the value out of it, and it's now starting to encroach across all industries, all businesses, all government, and people are now wanting it rather than it having pushed on them because of seeing the value that it can create.
Of course, we're beginning to discuss the details about what you do, and of course the various categorizations of risk that you're giving, and of course how they can be mitigated, because every company out there wants to know how they can minimize their risk and have their sustainability assured in the long term. But what I want to ask is, for the companies, of course there are a few laggards, really, if you may call them so, who are not taking any effort towards addressing and thinking in terms of risk so much. How is it for them?
I think the history of business is scattered with the result of people like that, and I think it's also true that some organisations say they are doing the right thing, yet down at the coalface something very different is happening. And I guess Enron would be a great example, where at the highest level all the things they said about their risk management was fantastic. They were doing all the right things on paper, but then when you look down at what was really going on, it was a very different story. So I think that a lot of those organisations, obviously we've got lots of examples of doing it wrongly. What we're realising now is the importance of a practical approach to risk management rather than perhaps what I call a policy or theoretical approach. We have to absolutely embed it in the business and have people passionate about it, rather than perhaps doing what we call a tick and flick exercise, that we'll do it but we'll just tick it off as being done but not really believe in it.
So from what I hear you say is, more and more people are beginning to see the benefit themselves and not having, the governments or the authorities coming on their back and telling them you must do A, B, C, D, but beginning to see the benefits of, having a robust or, a dynamic risk management or risk management team.
Very much so, and I think we had Professor Mervyn King at a conference the last 2 days, and one of the things he mentioned was that risk management cannot be legislated for. and that is really the compliance approach. And from that perspective, compliance itself is important, but it's restricted to what the person who's generating the compliance questions are. And if you miss something major, you'll have a real risk problem. So I think risk management has to come from a passion inside people rather than being told what they have to do. Otherwise, it will not be successful.
You mentioned an area that, of course, are becoming a bit later, talking about legislation, because there are those who, view weak corporate governance, or even which results in many risks, as also being, a failure in terms of legislation.